Most people think the Library of Alexandria burned down in one dramatic fire. Hollywood loves that image, flames consuming irreplaceable scrolls while scholars weep in the streets. The reality is considerably more complicated and somehow more tragic. The library actually died slowly, starved of funding, looted scroll by scroll, and likely still operating centuries after Caesar's famous accident with fire. It was part of something called the Mouseion, essentially the world's first government-funded think tank. The numbers are wild, somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, which is like saying your local library has between 1 and 17 floors. And the methods the Ptolemies used to stock those shelves would make modern librarians very uncomfortable. In the next 10 minutes, you'll understand why we genuinely don't know what happened, why the uncertainty itself tells us something important about ancient record-keeping, and why this particular lost library haunts us more than any other. The Library of Alexandria wasn't just a building full of scrolls. It was part of a larger research institution called the Mouseion, which was dedicated to the Muses, the 9 goddesses of the arts. Think of it as a combination of the Library of Congress, the Institute for Advanced Study, and a well-funded university campus all rolled into one complex. The Mouseion had lecture halls, laboratories, observatories, botanical gardens, and a zoo. Scholars lived there, received salaries from the state, and were exempt from taxes. Their only job was to research, teach, and expand human knowledge. This was revolutionary for the ancient world, where most learning happened privately or through individual patronage. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt understood something modern governments periodically forget, that investing in knowledge pays dividends across generations. The Mouseion attracted the brightest minds from across the Mediterranean. Euclid developed geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, and Herophilus performed some of the first systematic human dissections. The library was the information hub that made all of this possible, but it was never meant to function in isolation. It was the reference section of a much larger machine dedicated to understanding everything. The idea for a universal library in Alexandria likely came from Demetrius of Phalerum, an exiled Athenian statesman who found himself living in Alexandria around 297 BCE. Demetrius had governed Athens for a decade before backing the wrong side in a power struggle. An exile gave him time to think big thoughts about knowledge and its preservation. He proposed the concept to Ptolemy Isoter, the Macedonian general who had claimed Egypt after Alexander the Great's empire fractured. Ptolemy liked the idea enough to establish plans for it, which in royal terms often means commissioning feasibility studies and approving budgets. But the library itself probably wasn't actually built until the reign of his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who took power in 283 BCE. This is a classic case of one generation's vision becoming the next generation's project, something anyone who has worked in institutional planning will recognize immediately. The father gets credit for the idea. The son does the actual heavy lifting of construction and implementation, and historians argue for centuries about who deserves more recognition. Ptolemy II had the advantage of inheriting a stable, wealthy kingdom and the infrastructure his father had built. He poured resources into the library, turning his father's concept into the ancient world's premier research institution. Sometimes the best thing a visionary can do is raise a son willing to finish what he started. But coming up with the idea was the easy part. The real question is how they filled it with scrolls, and that's where things get ethically interesting. The Ptolemaic kings didn't just passively collect books. They pursued texts with what the historical sources delicately call aggressive and well-funded policies. According to various ancient accounts, they implemented what might be the most audacious library acquisition program in history. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbor were reportedly searched for books. Any scrolls found were confiscated and taken to the library, where scribes made copies. Sometimes the owners got their originals back. Sometimes they got the copies, and the library kept the originals. The receipts would carefully note from the ships as the provenance. The Ptolemies also sent agents with bags of gold to Athens, Rhodes, and other cultural centers to purchase or copy important texts. They borrowed the official state archives of Greek tragedies from Athens, put down an enormous deposit as guarantee of return, then simply kept the originals and forfeited the deposit. The Athenians were reportedly furious, but what could they do? Egypt was rich and far away. This wasn't scholarship. It was aggressive cultural accumulation backed by state power and serious money. The goal was comprehensive, to collect every text from every culture in the known world. They wanted Greek philosophy, Egyptian religious texts, Persian astronomy, Indian mathematics, Jewish scriptures, everything. The Library of Alexandria didn't wait for knowledge to arrive. It went out and took it, sometimes paying generously, sometimes just taking. It's the kind of institutional behavior that modern museums are still awkwardly reckoning with. Here's where things get genuinely frustrating for anyone who likes concrete facts. We don't know how many scrolls the Library of Alexandria held at its height. The estimates range from 40,000 to 700,000, which is not a margin of error. It's a complete lack of consensus. Some ancient sources claim 400,000 mixed volumes. Others say 700,000. Modern scholars look at the physical constraints of the building, the production capacity of ancient scribal workshops, and the available papyrus supply, and basically shrug. Part of the problem is that ancient books weren't like modern books. A single literary work might be copied across multiple scrolls. Homer's Iliad typically required several rolls of papyrus. So are we counting physical scrolls or distinct works? Different sources counted differently. Another problem is that we're relying on accounts written centuries after the library's peak, often by authors who never visited it and were working from earlier sources that are now lost. We know more about certain things than others. We have better records of grain shipments to Rome. We have clearer documentation of tax collection in rural Egypt. But somehow the exact contents of the ancient world's greatest library remain genuinely uncertain. This tells us something important about what ancient administrators thought was worth carefully recording. Absolutely. Revolutionary knowledge? Apparently that could be approximate. Still, we know enough about what was inside to understand why its loss hurt so much, and why that loss took far longer than one afternoon of fire. Julius Caesar's accidental fire in 48 BCE gets most of the blame, and there's something satisfying about having a clear villain and a specific date. Caesar was besieged in Alexandria, set fire to ships in the harbor to prevent their use by enemies, and the fire spread to warehouses that likely contained books destined for the library. But here's the thing. The library didn't die then. Ancient sources describe it continuing to function for centuries afterward. There were later incidents, destructive conflicts in 273 CE under Emperor Aurelian, edicts against pagan institutions in 391 CE under Christian Roman rule, and the Arab conquest in 642 CE. Each era has a story about the library's final destruction, which strongly suggests none of them actually finished the job. The truth appears to be that the library died gradually, the way most institutions die, through budget cuts, changing priorities, political instability, and simple neglect. Research funding dried up. Scholars went elsewhere. The Mouseion lost its tax exemptions. Scrolls weren't replaced when they deteriorated. The building was repurposed. Knowledge scattered across private collections and smaller libraries. There was no single catastrophic moment when someone barred the doors and torched the place, though that would have been dramatically tidier. Instead, the Library of Alexandria faded through a process we might call institutional entropy. It's less satisfying than one heroic fire, but probably closer to how most important things actually end. The Library of Alexandria haunts us in ways other lost ancient institutions don't. Partly that's because we know just enough to imagine what we lost. The mathematical treatises, the alternative histories, the plays and poems that existed in single copies. But mostly it's because the library represents something we still struggle with, the fragility of knowledge and the effort required to preserve it. Every age thinks its information storage system is permanent. The Ptolemies used papyrus, which disintegrates in humidity. We use digital systems that require constant migration and maintenance. The medium changes, but the vulnerability doesn't. The library wasn't destroyed by one fire or one enemy. It failed when people stopped believing it was worth the investment, when funding priorities shifted, when each generation assumed someone else would handle preservation. That's not ancient history. That's every research library and archive today constantly justifying their existence and their budgets. The real lesson of Alexandria isn't about dramatic loss. It's about the unglamorous, persistent work required to keep knowledge alive across generations. The scrolls didn't burn in one afternoon. They disappeared slowly, one budget meeting at a time.